The rumble of the trucks slowed as they rolled through the iron gates. Dozens of women, secretaries, nurses, auxiliaries, sat rigid on wooden benches, their eyes fixed on the barbed wire that stretched in every direction. Dust swirled behind them, settling on uniforms already torn from weeks of movement. The convoy came to a halt, and with it came the sound they feared most, the heavy boots of American guards. Rifles glinted in the afternoon light. The soldiers' silhouettes looked impossibly tall against the horizon, their broad shoulders and steady steps reminding the women of every warning their officers had given them. The Americans are brutes, they had been told. If captured, you will face humiliation worse than death. Those words echoed louder now than the crunch of gravel beneath the boots outside. A young woman, no older than 19, gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles whitened. Her lips moved soundlessly in prayer. Another stared at the dirt floor, refusing to meet the eyes of her captors as the door was pulled open. The guards spoke in English, voices brisk and commanding. The women could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Orders. They filed out one by one, their hearts pounding in their throats. Outside, the sunlight struck hard. Rows of watchtowers loomed above, rifles visible at every angle. The women's eyes darted to the nearest fence, the spirals of barbed wire shimmering like blades. They had heard rumors on the journey, rumors that prisoners were starved, beaten, mocked, rumors that women especially were at risk of fates unspoken. Each step felt like walking deeper into that nightmare. As they lined up, the American soldiers towered nearby, their faces stern but unreadable. Some carried clipboards, others rifles, but none raised a hand or even a voice beyond the necessary commands. Still, fear turned every gesture into a threat. When one guard adjusted his helmet, a nurse flinched, expecting a blow. When another pointed toward the barracks, several women braced for violence. Instead, they were marched in silence. No shoves, no jeers, only the steady rhythm of boots and the sharp bark of orders. Yet silence itself was frightening, because it offered no clue of what was to come. Inside the camp, wooden barracks stood in rows, smoke rising from chimneys. The smell of food drifted faintly in the air, though none dared acknowledge it. They focused only on the guards' rifles, gleaming at their sides. The first night would begin in silence, but silence was not comfort. To the women, it was the pause before cruelty, the waiting breath before the storm. And so they entered captivity, carrying not only their belongings, but the crushing weight of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the enemy, fear of what it meant to have survived when they were told survival was dishonor. The barracks door shut behind them with a heavy thud. Inside, the women stood uncertainly, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. Rows of bunks stretched in long lines, the smell of wood and damp cloth filling the air. No one spoke at first. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the muffled voices of American guards outside. The women exchanged wary glances, each remembering the same warnings. Before their capture, German officers had spoken endlessly of American cruelty. They described the enemy as savages, men who would treat women as little more than spoils of war. The threat was not always spoken outright. Sometimes it was delivered through narrowed eyes and dark silences, other times through crude stories whispered around campfires. But the meaning was clear. Fear the Americans. And fear they did. Some sat down stiffly on the bunks, clutching their bags as though the meager belongings inside might offer protection. Others remained standing, too tense to rest. One nurse whispered that they would not survive the night. Another said the food, if given, would be poisoned. A third insisted that the Americans would parade them for mockery at dawn. Every creak of boots outside deepened their dread. When shadows passed across the window, they froze, waiting for the door to burst open. Yet minutes stretched into an hour, and no one entered. The guards outside spoke in low tones, their words calm, almost casual, as if the women's terror meant nothing at all. When a tray of food was finally brought in, bread, soup, and steaming cups of something bitter-smelling, the women recoiled. None moved to touch it. Suspicion ran through them like a current. One woman whispered that the soup was laced with something. Another hid a piece of bread beneath her skirt, unwilling to eat but unwilling to let it go. Hunger gnawed at them, but fear gnawed harder. The food sat untouched, steam curling upward in the cold air, a symbol of their uncertainty. To the Americans, this was routine, meals provided according to regulations. To the women, it was a trap waiting to snap shut. And so they sat in silence, clutching blankets, watching shadows move across the windows, waiting for proof of the nightmare they had been promised. But no cruelty came. Only silence, food, and the lingering question that none dared voice. Had everything they'd been told about the enemy been a lie? Dawn crept slowly across the camp, painting the barracks windows with pale light. The women sat awake, many of them having slept little, waiting for the dreaded moment when the Americans would return. The sound came first, the heavy crunch of boots on gravel. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, and every step tightened the knot of fear in their stomachs. When the door opened, several women flinched as if struck. 2 American guards entered, rifles slung across their shoulders. Their faces were unreadable, their posture firm but not aggressive. The women pressed back against the bunks, eyes wide, expecting shouts, blows, or worse. The guards spoke quickly in English, gestures indicating the women should line up. None moved at first. The silence thickened. One guard raised his hand, not to strike, but to motion again toward the doorway. His expression carried irritation, but not cruelty. Slowly, reluctantly, the women obeyed. They filed into line, their movements stiff, each step heavy with dread. Their eyes remained fixed on the rifles, certain the slightest mistake would trigger violence. Outside, the morning was cold. A thin mist clung to the wire fences, and the watchtowers loomed overhead. The guards marched them toward a central square where other prisoners were already gathered. Some women clutched their blankets close, others kept their heads bowed, refusing to meet the gaze of the Americans who surrounded them. Every gesture felt dangerous. The roll call began. Names were mispronounced, numbers tallied. To the Americans, it was routine procedure. To the women, it was a moment of humiliation, their identities reduced to lists and records. One young POW trembled so violently she could barely answer when called. An American guard frowned, then spoke sharply, not in anger but in frustration. Still, she recoiled as though she had been struck. When the roll was finished, the guards herded them toward another building. No blows had been delivered, no jeers shouted. Yet fear still clung to every breath because silence itself was foreign. The women whispered to each other as they walked, their voices hushed. Why hadn't the soldiers harmed them yet? Was this some cruel delay? The questions gnawed at them louder than any order. Every step through the camp deepened their confusion. Fear had not lessened. It had only changed shape. And though no violence had come, their dread remained sharper than ever, sharpened by uncertainty, sharpened by the terrifying possibility that they no longer understood their enemy at all. The women were led into a long hall, the scent of food hitting them before their eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Wooden tables stretched in neat rows, each laid with metal trays, cups, and bread. The smell was overwhelming: warm bread, boiled potatoes, and something rich, perhaps stew. It was the kind of abundance none of them had seen in months. Yet fear did not loosen its grip. They stood frozen in the doorway, unwilling to believe that such food was truly meant for them. An American guard barked a short order, gesturing toward the tables. The women hesitated. Finally, one stepped forward, moving as if into a trap. The benches creaked as they sat, stiff and silent. Their eyes darted to the guards who watched from the walls, rifles resting casually at their sides. Bowls of stew were placed before them, steam curling into the cold air. The women stared at the food, suspicion plain on their faces. One whispered that it was poisoned. Another refused to touch her spoon, convinced it was all a cruel trick. Hunger and fear wrestled silently across the tables. The turning point came when an American guard sat at a nearby table, filled his own bowl with the same stew, and began to eat. He chewed without hesitation, his posture casual, unconcerned. The women exchanged glances. Slowly, cautiously, one prisoner raised her spoon and took a bite. Her eyes widened. No bitterness, no trick, only warmth and flavor she had almost forgotten. Soon another followed, then another. The hall filled with the faint clatter of spoons against bowls, the sound of tentative chewing. The food was real. For many, it was the first proper meal in weeks. The bread was soft, the stew thick, the coffee strange but warming. It was not a feast, but it was survival. And more than survival, it was strange kindness, yet fear did not vanish entirely. Some women still ate in silence, their eyes fixed on the guards, waiting for cruelty to erupt. Every smile, every gesture of calm felt suspicious. Still hunger did its work. Bowls emptied, bread vanished, and by the end, the silence had shifted. Not comfort, not yet, but confusion. The women had been promised humiliation, starvation, and torment. Instead, they had eaten. And in that simple act, the first cracks began to appear in the wall of fear they had built around themselves. As dusk fell over the camp, the women were herded back to their barracks. The air outside had grown sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from the guard posts. Inside, lanterns cast long shadows across the wooden walls. The bunks creaked under tired bodies, blankets pulled tightly as if they could shield against fear. No one spoke at first. The silence was heavy, each woman wrapped in her own thoughts, her own memories of the journey that had brought her here. Some lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the warnings they had been told. The Americans will be merciless. The Americans will strip you of dignity. Every sound outside, the bark of a dog, the crunch of gravel, the faint hum of guards speaking in English, made them flinch. One woman whispered that the kindness of food was only temporary, that worse treatment would come once their captors grew tired of pretense. Another shook her head, too drained to argue, clutching her blanket as though it were the last thing that belonged to her. Through the thin walls, the faint notes of a harmonica drifted across the night. The tune was slow, almost melancholy, and it unsettled the prisoners. Music was the last thing they expected from armed guards. It seemed almost human, too human, and the contradiction gnawed at their sense of fear. Sleep came in fits. Some women wept quietly, muffling the sound against their pillows. Others lay rigid, determined not to close their eyes. Certain danger would come before dawn. The youngest prisoner, no more than 18, whispered a prayer in the dark. Her voice trembled, but no one stopped her. For the first time, prayer felt like survival, not defiance. Hours dragged on. Guards continued their patrols, voices calm, footsteps steady. The feared intrusion never came. When morning light finally seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, many of the women were surprised to find themselves still alive, still unharmed. And in that realization lay the faintest flicker of something unexpected. Not trust, not yet, but the first seed of doubt in the terrifying stories they had been told. The morning roll call came brisk and early. The guards shouted names from a list, mispronouncing most but checking each face against their records. The women stood stiffly, their bodies tense against the cold air. When the roll ended, orders were barked again. This time, gestures made the meaning clear. The prisoners were to be divided into groups and sent to work. Fear surged once more. They had heard of forced labor, fields without food, endless hours under lash and boot. Whispers spread quickly. This is the beginning of it. The first group was led toward the kitchens. Steam rose from the chimneys, carrying with it the faint smell of bread. The women assigned there braced themselves for punishment, yet found only pots, pans, and instructions. The second group was marched toward the laundry. Large tubs of water waited, soap piled beside them. To the prisoners, even this felt strange. Why would the enemy care if their clothes were clean? The rest were handed brooms, rakes, and tools for clearing the grounds. Not back-breaking labor, not humiliation, just routine camp maintenance. Suspicion lingered. Every movement of the guards was studied for signs of cruelty. Yet the Americans only supervised, correcting with gestures, not blows. One nurse, her hands raw from weeks of marching, was startled when a guard noticed her struggling with a heavy bucket. He pointed, frowned, and replaced it with a lighter one. She froze, unsure how to process the gesture. In the kitchens, the smell of baking bread filled the air. Prisoners stirred pots and cut vegetables, their stomachs twisting with hunger. When a guard sampled the stew, he handed one woman a spoon, as if asking her to taste. She hesitated, certain it was a test, but the warmth of the broth against her lips was real. She blinked back tears, both from heat and disbelief. In the laundry, steam rose around the women as they scrubbed uniforms. The soap stung their skin, but the rhythm of the work was almost familiar. For the first time, their hands were busy with something other than fear. Hours passed. No lash fell, no rifle butt struck. The guards watched, but without cruelty. By midday, the women were led back to the barracks. Tired, yes, but not broken. And confusion, more than fear, now filled their thoughts. If work was not punishment, then what was it? Each woman carried that question back inside the barracks, where silence returned once more, heavy, uneasy, but no longer entirely ruled by terror. The women returned to the barracks, expecting the familiar silence, but instead they found something different. Food left waiting on the tables. Bread, apples, and even small tins of butter. At first, none moved. Suspicion was still strong, but hunger gnawed deeper than fear, and slowly hands reached out. One young POW tore into the bread, the crust crackling under her teeth. Another lifted an apple, its red skin polished, so unlike the shriveled fruit they had seen back home. The guards watched, but did not interfere. One even smirked when a woman smeared butter too thickly on her bread, leaving it dripping. The sound of quiet laughter passed through the group, uneasy but real. Later that day, a nurse dropped her blanket while walking across the yard. Before she could bend to pick it up, a guard stooped first and handed it back. She froze, stunned into silence. It was a simple gesture, one that meant nothing to him, but everything to her. She had expected cruelty at every turn. Instead, she was given back her possession with respect. Another moment came at the well, where women struggled to carry buckets of water. A guard stepped forward, not to mock, not to punish, but to carry one himself, setting it down with a shrug as though it were nothing. Whispers spread quickly through the barracks that night. Some insisted these gestures were tricks designed to lower their defenses. Others argued that kindness was too casual, too small to be calculated. Fear did not vanish, but it began to fracture. For the first time since capture, some women dared to believe that not every American hand carried malice. Still, confusion remained. The stories they had been told before surrender, the warnings of brutality and shame, clashed violently with what their own eyes now saw. The guards' small acts unsettled them more than threats would have. Cruelty they could have endured, expected. But kindness, that was harder to resist. In the silence of the night, some women admitted it quietly to themselves. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. The thought was terrifying, almost more than fear itself. For to question the stories of their leaders, their officers, their homeland, was to step into dangerous territory. And so the women lay awake, their minds turning over the same impossible thought. What if survival meant rewriting everything they believed about the enemy? The barracks had been quiet for days, broken only by whispers and the creak of wooden bunks. Fear had kept voices low, as though speaking too loudly might provoke punishment. But now something changed. After another day of routine labor and meals, a few women dared to speak openly, their words cautious but louder than before. They compared the food, some marveling at the portions, others admitting it was more than they had eaten in weeks before capture. The very act of conversation carried a new boldness. At one table, a nurse laughed softly when recalling how a guard had stumbled in the mud, his tall frame collapsing in an undignified heap. The others listened, shocked, not by the story, but by the sound of laughter itself. It spread tentatively, like a forbidden fire. Women who had sat in silence now joined in, sharing small stories of the camp, stories that painted their captors not as monsters, but as men. One woman admitted she had tasted chocolate for the first time, given by a guard. Another whispered that she had been handed an extra apple with a wink. These moments, once hoarded in silence, were now spoken aloud. Suspicions still lingered. Some warned against lowering their guard. "It's all a trick," one muttered. Yet even she could not ignore the evidence. No cruelty had come, only routine and small kindnesses. The night felt different. The harmonica played again outside, its soft tune drifting into the barracks. This time, instead of recoiling, some women leaned closer to the sound. It reminded them of evenings back home, of brothers playing instruments, of dances in village halls, of a world before war had swallowed everything. The fear that had gripped them so tightly was loosening, not vanishing, but fraying at the edges. In its place grew something far more dangerous to their old beliefs: curiosity. Who were these Americans, really? If they were not brutes, not monsters, then what had they been fighting against all this time? The question spread silently across the bunks, unspoken yet shared. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, a willingness to wonder. And as dawn approached, many women realized that the greatest shock of all was not survival, not food, not even kindness. It was the realization that their fear itself might have been built on lies. The days began to settle into rhythm. Roll call, meals, work assignments, lights out. What once felt like looming terror now became routine, and routine itself was unsettling. The women had braced for brutality at every step, yet the cruelty never came. Instead, there were rules, schedules, and a strange kind of order. Some prisoners began to walk with less hesitation, their shoulders no longer hunched, in constant dread. A few even dared to meet the eyes of their guards. One afternoon, an American soldier paused while handing out trays of food. He smiled briefly, almost shyly, before moving on. For the women, the moment was shocking in its simplicity. How could a captor smile? How could an enemy act like a neighbor? The contradiction gnawed at the foundations of everything they had been taught. Whispers grew bolder in the barracks. Some admitted openly that the Americans were not what they had imagined. Others argued fiercely, insisting it was all deception. The conflict was not physical, but internal. Fear was cracking, replaced by something both softer and sharper: doubt. For the nurse who had once trembled at every shadow, the turning point came when she watched a guard hand his canteen to another prisoner, letting her drink first. The act was small, but it shattered her last defenses. She realized then that the enemy she had feared so deeply was capable of gestures her own officers had never shown. The paradox stung. In Germany, obedience had meant enduring suffering without complaint. Here, obedience meant being treated with an unexpected, confusing dignity. The women began to question not just their captors, but themselves. Could fear alone sustain them? Could hatred survive against evidence of humanity? They did not yet have the answers. But the silence that once held only terror now carried something else: the first quiet seeds of reluctant respect. And though no one dared to admit it aloud, many of the women sensed it clearly. Fear was no longer absolute. It was cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of reality. And once cracks appear in a wall of fear, collapse becomes only a matter of time. By the final weeks of their captivity, the fear that had once consumed the women no longer held the same power. The American camp was still guarded by rifles and barbed wire, but its true strength lay in something unexpected. It was not cruelty that controlled them, but routine. It was not intimidation that shaped their days, but discipline wrapped in civility. Meals arrived on schedule. Blankets were replaced when worn, and even medicine was given without favoritism. These things should have been ordinary, yet to the women they remained extraordinary. Some of them had begun to keep small journals, scribbles of daily life, of meals eaten, of kindnesses noticed. They wrote not only to remember, but to make sense of the world that had turned upside down. One woman wrote, "I was told the Americans were beasts, but beasts do not hand you bread, nor do they smile when you cough from bitter coffee." That single line captured the transformation more than any speech or lecture could. Fear was being replaced by reflection. The nurse who had once trembled at the touch of a medic's hand now found herself watching the guards with a new, unsettling thought. Not, "They are enemies," but "They are people." The shift was dangerous in its own way. It meant that the women could no longer hide behind the certainty of hate. They had to confront the possibility that everything they had been taught had been a lie. Some resisted to the end, clinging to the old beliefs like armor. Others allowed the cracks to widen, letting curiosity seep in where fear had once dominated. The Americans never knew the depth of the change they had sparked. To them, the treatment of prisoners was simple policy. To the women, it was revolution. What began as trembling terror at the sound of boots had ended in something far more complex: a recognition that the world was larger, stranger, and less certain than they had been told. When the day of release finally came, the women walked beyond the barbed wire, not as the same prisoners who had once cowered inside. They carried questions heavier than chains, questions about honor, humanity, and truth. They had feared the Americans. Then they had doubted them. And now, as they stepped into an uncertain future, they carried the one thing their captors had never intended to give: an entirely new definition of the enemy. For fear, once shattered, cannot be rebuilt. And for these women, the greatest shock of all was realizing that kindness, not cruelty, had undone them.